Okay, so I'm delighted to chair the first of our panels in this conference. And we have a very nice group, even though two of our panelists had to drop out, López-Calva and Facundo Alvaredo, one for family reasons and the other one for work reasons. But the remainders are great, so we are sure that the panel will be quite good. The first speaker is going to be Francisco Ferreira, who's now the World Bank's chief economist for the Africa region, and also part of this project that I was telling you, in which the World Bank is working on inequality dynamics, and also a co-editor of the special issue of the Journal of Economic Inequalities, a special issue dedicated to the appraisal of databases on inequality. And Chico has many publications in very prestigious journals. Despite being in a multilateral institution, he's kept up with his publication record and was a co-director of the World Development Report in 2006 on equity and development. And now he's going to be moving to research very soon, where he's going to be the advisor. The chief advisor you're going to be, right? Senior advisor in the research department at the World Bank. He will be overseeing the poverty, inequality, and agricultural development. And among other things, one of his tasks is to help redefine the poverty line, the international poverty line, now that there is a new set of purchasing power parity information that came out of the 2011 round. So we'll have a new poverty line. The 125 will be old news after 6 months or so. So Chico, without further ado, the floor is yours, and I'm going to introduce you every time that you present.
Thank you, Nora, and thanks to both Nora and the other organizers for the invitation. The day started very well with a great opening panel, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the conference. What I want to do in the next 15 minutes is go over quickly a brief presentation of a joint paper that I'm writing with Julián Messina, who's here, and Sergio Firpo, our co-author from the São Paulo School of Economics, which is called A More Level Playing Field, explaining the decline in earnings inequality in Brazil in 95 to 2012. Short time, so 4 things I want to do. Just tell you what the question is that we're trying to answer. The suspects, a bit like a mystery novel. The suspects, very brief on the data and methodology, and some results and conclusion. And the question is, what accounts for the 10-point decline in the Gini coefficient for labor incomes in this period that I say there, between 95 and 2012 in Brazil? So, you know, there was a paragraph motivating each panel for this conference. In the one for this panel, there's a lot of different questions. One of them is, what's happening to earnings inequality? And so this is what this focuses on very, very, very narrowly. And in fact, it's related to 2 points that Rebecca made. I don't think Rebecca's here now. Oh, she is. So Rebecca made points about the importance of labor earnings, the primary income distribution in labor markets in particular, and also issues around horizontal inequality, which weren't intended to be the focus of this paper, but turn out to be important in some of our findings. So the question is a very narrow and well-defined one. This is not a particular big picture paper. It's really looking at this evolution in the earnings inequality, which took place in the context of a broader decline in inequality in household per capita income in the period. So what you see in this graph is actually per capita income, the Gini coefficient for household per capita income. And Brazil is, of course, just one example of this broader trend in Latin America that Nora described in her remarks earlier. And you see in Brazil this kind of flat, very high level of income inequality at around 60 until 2002 or so, and then a considerable decline of about 7 Gini points to 2011, and it goes on after that. But that's where our data starts. And And as Nora has already indicated, and in another version, a longer version of this presentation, I have a slide that refers to other work that suggests that various factors are behind this, but the dynamics in the labor market, so the dynamics around the earnings distribution, are probably the most important. And this is a point that I think both Nora and Rebecca made earlier. They are true in Brazil as well. So in this paper, we focus only on labor income inequality. And here you've got, again, the household per capita income line. These are confidence intervals, which are kind of redundant in this case because they're so small. But anyway, this is labor income. This is what we're looking at. And you see this decline, you know, of 20% from 0.5 to 0.4 in Gini points, which is, you know, a marked decline. It is a substantial change in the distribution of earnings in Brazil over these 17 years or so. And the same picture holds. In fact, it is more pronounced in proportional terms for alternative measures of inequality like the tile index or the 90-10 percentile ratios, which I don't show here for reasons of time. So what's behind this? And so we, you know, thinking of a standard kind of Mincer framework, a human capital framework, there are, you know, we could think of a number of possible candidates or suspects to account for this change. The first is the one that Nora emphasized in her presentation, which is a human capital story. So we know that there was an increase in the supply of education over this period, which outpaced the increase in the demand for education. So there's both an increase in supply and declines in the return to education. On the side of experience, the labor force in Brazil was also aging, so potential experience was increasing. But in addition to that core story, which is in some sense the received wisdom now in the literature about this, there are a number of alternative things that could be going on, some of which was also mentioned earlier. One of them is actual changes in labor market institutions. So there was, as I'll show you in a moment, a very marked rise in the real value of the minimum wage in Brazil in this period. There was also a considerable change in the formal-informal breakdown of the labor force, with the Brazilian labor force formalizing quite markedly over this period. So that had been less studied to some extent. Marcelo here and others have worked on minimum wages in the past, but the role of this in this particular context we felt deserved looking at as well in this context. There are some changes in the what I call demographics, so the gender and racial composition of the labor force, and potentially there may have been changes in returns to those characteristics, and the degree of quote-unquote discrimination, if we suspend disbelief for a moment now. But just, let's not call it discrimination, let's just, you know, the gaps in gender and race controlling for other things. And presumably there could be spatial factors as well. That's something else that Rebecca mentioned in terms of territorial and spatial inequalities that could be changing. This was a period of a commodity boom. Brazil was a big exporter of soybeans and other things. It's possible that rural incomes were rising for reasons that are not to do with education, for example. So this is what we're looking at a little bit. So let me show you what are they called? Mugshots of some of these suspects. So here's a mugshot of the increase in the supply of education. Right? So this is the cumulative distribution function of years of schooling. So I think everyone in this room knows a lower CDF is one which is better, right? So the density function is shifting to the left. This is 1996 to the right, sorry. This is 2003. This is 2012. So you see this big increase in years of schooling. One way to see that is to focus, for example, on what's happening at 10 years of schooling, which is secondary incomplete. So what this tells you is that at the beginning of the period, around 75% of the Brazilian labor force had secondary incomplete. By the end of the period, that was lower than 50%, okay? With the rest being to the right, if you see what I'm saying. So the distribution of education, the quantity of years of schooling were shifting dramatically. And at the same time, as I said, I won't show you the picture, the population was aging, though that was, of course, a more gradual process. Moving from the human capital to the labor market institution suspects and mugshots, here's a mugshot of the rising minimum wage. These are three wage series: average earnings, median earnings, and the minimum wage, normalized to be 1 at 95, so these are indices. You see in the average and the median a decline in average quite marked, in median not so marked until around 2002. So actual levels were falling in this period and then increasing afterwards. But throughout the period, certainly since around 97 or 98, a very marked increase in minimum wages, which actually doubled in real terms over this period. Okay? Now, as a result of this, the density the density function of earnings, I don't know how clear that is, but it's actually probably clearer if you're looking at it that way rather than diagonally. But you see, I quite like this picture. This is the density function shifting to the right, and at the same time as that's happening, this big spike at the minimum wage, so the vertical line is the minimum wage, becoming increasingly pronounced. You see the spike at the minimum wage becoming increasingly pronounced. Now, the results we found for the minimum wage were actually not what we expected. And in order well, at least we think, in order for us to understand what's going on, it's important to note these little numbers here, which tell you the mass of the density distribution below the minimum wage and how it changed over time. And what happened was it went from around 22% in the early period to 30% in the middle period, okay, and then down to 29%. So that means that non-compliance with the minimum wage rose over the initial period and then slightly declined. That will turn out to be important later on. Remember, it's a murder mystery, so keep that information in your minds. The labor market was also formalizing, as I said, so formal employment went from, informal employment fell from 52%. That's sem carteira for the Brazilians in the room, that's conta própria. So self-employment and informal, the sum went from 52 to 42%. So 10 percentage points increase in formality over this period in Brazil. Another institutional change or change in the structure of the labor market that might have played a role in the distribution of earnings. So we wanted to look at that. Gender and racial composition of the labor force. So women's participation in the labor force went from 38% to 42%. The whites in the labor force went from 57% to about 47%. So also a big increase in the non-white composition of the labor force over this period. Some continued urbanization with rural changing from 19 to 14%. Almost no change in the regional composition there across the 5 regions. So with those suspects, what did we do? Basically, tell you very briefly, given the time constraints, what we did is basically we ran a sort of variant of a Oaxaca blinder decomposition using the Firpo-Fortin-Lemieux method that at least the economists in the room will probably know, which is a kind of unconditional quantile regression applied to these decompositions. The data we used is the PNAD, it's the bread and butter for people looking at income distribution in Brazil. We compared those pairs of years. We paired the years 95 and 96 as the early period, 2002, 2003, 2004, 2005, 2011, 2012. We focused on a wage measure, which was total gross monthly income, monthly individual labor earnings. So that's not an hourly, it's a monthly measure, so there's an hourly thing that's maybe going on there. For 18 to 65-year-olds, men and women everywhere, we excluded the rural north of Brazil because PNAD only started covering that in 2004. So, as I was saying, what we're interested in is understanding these changes, right, in the earnings distribution, which can be summarized by various distributional statistics, say the mean wage and the Gini coefficient, which is what I'm going to show you results for, but you could also do it for the entire quantile of the distribution or for the tile index or for whatever you wanted. What the Oaxaca blinder decomposition does is, as you know, and Firpo-Fortin-Lemieux allow us to do as well for these more complex statistics, is to decompose the overall change, say in the Gini, into 2 components. One that's due to, one that's the endowment effect. That's this one. Yes, that's this one. That's the endowment effect. That's just, if you think in terms of Oaxaca blinder, that's the changes in the axis, the changes in the quantities that I've shown you so far. And then the other one is the change in returns, which is the change in the conditional distribution. So if you think in terms of Oaxaca blinder, the changes in the betas, okay? So that's what we do. And so we end up running a regression which is just like an OLS regression, except as in the Firpo-Fortin-Lemieux method, it's a regression not of incomes, but of what they call the recentered influence function of incomes, which it basically is the influence of each particular bit of income on the Gini, which is called an influence function in statistics, recentered to the gene. So it's basically some transformation. It's fancy stuff. Our co-author Sergio knows it better than Julian and me, published it in Econometrica, allows us to do fancy things, but it's basically an OLS regression, okay, but with the riff here on the left-hand side. Run on the suspects. So some human capital variables, some demographic variables, some spatial variables, minimum wage, and informality. In this version of the paper, and I should say this is still work in progress, and Julian, Sergio, and I are still working on it, and there will be some changes in the final version, although I'm told the story doesn't change very much. You can ask Julian about that. But in this specification, we use fully categorical variables to allow for functional form flexibility. And I'll show you that, that regression in the next slide. But just to say, when you do use dummies, which is basically what these categorical variables are, then we know that the Oaxaca blinder decomposition is not insensitive, is not invariant to the base categories, to the omitted categories. So one must make a choice. The choice we made was the one, the specification that reduced the influence of the constant term, the unexplained constant term. So just so you know, these things actually do matter. So I don't expect you to look at these regressions. This is just to show you what the dummies are. Okay, so for age, we got those that you can see there. 5 categories, 1 omitted. For schooling, you got those 5 categories. Omitted is tertiary complete. Then we got a dummy for being below the minimum wage. A dummy for self-employment and sem carteira. Omitted is com carteira. 3 different racial compositions, female dummy, rural dummy, and the regions, okay? Yeah, 1 minute, okay. So, so then, with 1 minute, the results. So we run those regressions, right? And then we decompose for each of those groups. So what we actually run is in each of those groups, we don't run this exact regression. What we run is a regression where within each of those groups, there's a full interaction of all the dummies. So age and experience, age and education are interacted in here. Race and dummies, race and gender interacted in here. Region and rural interacted in here, and so on. Okay, so there are these full interactions within that. It's a fully saturated model within the group to allow for as much flexibility again as possible. So run that and then separate the effect into endowments and structure. So again, if you're thinking of Oaxaca blinder, think of X's and betas. And we have it for the overall period and then the 2 sub-periods. So given the time, let me focus on a few key results here. So first of all, this is the mean, okay? So there's an increase, of course, in mean earnings over this period, a lot of which comes from human capital. This is the increase in schooling, okay? That increases the mean quite a lot. There's also an increase in the mean that's coming, this is largely an endowment effect. There's also an increase in mean that's coming from falling gaps in gender and race gaps, okay, and from the minimum wage. But those are coming from the betas rather than the X's. Those are coming from the structure. That is to say, it's not to do with the increase in labor force participation of women necessarily. It's to do with the fact that the gap between men's and women's earnings, or between whites and blacks, is decreasing in Brazil, controlling for education. This is not an educational effect. Okay. Then there's the sub-period breakdown, which I don't have time to go into. Now this is means, so this is not inequality. So for inequality, let's look at the Gini a little bit. And here, the basic story is there is a big decline in the whole period, okay? Only a small part of which, in our specification, comes from the human capital story, which, you know, as Nora pointed out, is a big part of the story in general, and one that we often focused on is an important part. So what we see our paper contributing to is it confirms that it does that, and it does that in the way that we always expected, which is, you know, a countervailing endowment effect and a strong structure effect. Let me say a word about that, okay? So what this is the returns falling, okay, as a result of there being many more skilled people and fewer unskilled people. This is the returns falling. This is what Francois Bourguignon, Nora, and I had some earlier paper called the paradox of progress, which is that the mechanical effect of having more schooling when the returns to schooling are convex is actually to increase inequality because there's more mass in the convex part of the distribution. Okay? So together, those lead to this kind of decline over here. Now, interesting things. There's a big part of the decline in the Gini which is due to these three structural effects here. Those are decreasing gaps between men and women, between the races. Okay? This one is urban and rural, so the segmentation, the urban-rural segmentation and the regional segmentation falling, and a greater formality. Okay? The last part of the story, which was the surprising one, is the minimum wages, which I fully expected in the beginning. The minimum wages would be a contribution to this. It turns out, looking at the overall period, that minimum wages were unequalizing. And the reason they were unequalizing was an endowment effect. What's an endowment effect? It's composition, not returns. So that has to do, and that comes all from this first period, which is exactly the period when non-compliance was rising from 22% to 30%. I gave you a hint earlier that that was important. That is the fact that minimum wages rising during a time when the labor market couldn't support it led to increases in non-compliance that were unequalizing. In the latter period, when the labor market was booming and could support the larger increase in minimum wages were equalizing, both through an endowment and through a structure effect. Okay? So that's kind of the story. And given the time, I'm going to skip all of this and just go to my concluding slide. So, you know, the basic message from this little paper of ours is, in contrast to earlier periods, the story of these 17 years in Brazil was a happier one. Unemployment, which I didn't show you, fell. Earnings rose, both average and median. Not only did the average earnings rise, but they rose most for those groups of workers who used to earn the least. Not only workers that were poorer, but also the racial minorities, women, and people in rural areas. There was a compression in the schooling premium, which is very important, but perhaps even more impressive were the reduction in wage gaps amongst workers that are equivalent in terms of human capital. Controlling for that, there's this big increase in people that differ along race, gender, location, and type of job. For this conference, given the title, the question to add here is, I have no idea about this, but I guess the interesting question is, which parts of this happy story will survive into the new regime when growth is again lower and we have a number of complex challenges facing the Brazilian economy? That's a question for us all to discuss. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Chico. Now we turn to Tasha Fairfield, who is an assistant professor at the London School of Economics and also an affiliate to the Department of Government at LSE. And Tasha is going to bring in the top 1%, at least in one country, right? You're going to look at Chile. And I like to say, and I'm going to buy, a book that she has published or is about to come out, called Private Wealth and Public Revenue in Latin America, Business Power and Tax Politics. Sounds very interesting. So, Tasha, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. So my research does in fact focus on inequality and taxation. And I'm going to start by saying a few things about this paper with Michel Herat on Chilean top income shares, which is most directly related to the panel themes. And then I'm going to say a little bit about my core research on the politics of inequality in this project on taxation that I've been working on. So I just want to draw out some findings from this book that I think speak to the role of economic elites in governance and prospects for redistribution. So my co-author and I, after about 10 years, were able to get access to the full universe of income tax returns for 2 years, 2005 and 2009. And using that data, we were able to reconstruct top income shares without having to do any kind of extrapolation because of the full universe that we got. Now, we supplement that data with tabulated information from 2003 to 2013. Got a little bit of Macintosh to PC conversion issues. So this is the only data that's publicly available, is this tabulated data from 2003 to 2013. So our estimates for those years are much more approximate. So if you focus on what should be the blue line here, you can see that the top 1% share in Chile is among the highest in the world, up there with Colombia and the United States and South Africa. The red line above it is showing top income shares that have been adjusted for evasion. Now, the issue that's going on here is that Chile's tax system created particularly strong incentives for business owners to underdeclare their distributed profits and their dividends. So what happens is that if you reinvested your profits in the firm, you were paying only a very low 15% corporate tax rate. If you took out dividends and distributed profits, those paid much higher personal income tax rates of up to 40%. So to give you an idea of sort of the scale of the avoidance evasion problem that was created by this very large gap between the personal income tax and the corporate tax, national account figures suggest that the actual amount of distributed profits is 3 times as much as what gets declared to the tax agency. So we think that it is important to look at shares that have been estimated or have been adjusted for evasion as well, even though the shares from the rest of the top income database don't do that kind of adjustment.
You talk about the
I'm sorry?
you're talking about the database of the size?
Right, so the other top 1% shares here have been taken from the top incomes database, and they do not take evasion into account, but because of this peculiar aspect of the Chilean tax system, we think that this is probably a better way to compare, or that these are certainly underestimated for Chile. Now, when we include accrued profits in the definition of income, instead of distributed profits, our top income shares go up quite a bit, to at least 23%. So what you're seeing here is that including unrealized capital income increases inequality. So this is a novel aspect of our paper. We were able to get information from business tax returns that allowed us to sort of iteratively impute accrued profits to the owners. And this is something that hasn't been possible to do for other countries yet. So the best that we can do in terms of comparisons is to look at top income shares for other countries that include capital gains. So this is clearly not entirely compatible in terms of comparisons, but it does give you an idea of how extremely concentrated capital income is in Chile. Now, despite that very tremendous income concentration, Chileans in the top 1% until recently were paying an effective tax rate of only 15%.
Maybe in the US.
Right, so you can compare that to the rate in the US was actually 24%, which is substantially higher. And of course, the US is hardly an example of equity. So coming back to the panel themes, have the rich been getting richer? Well, from our data, it's not really clear whether we have a decreasing trend for Chile, because remember, we just had the microdata for these 2 years, 2005 and 2009. And we don't entirely trust what the tabulated data is showing. But what is clear is that the rich in Chile and elsewhere in Latin America, for which we have studies, are very, very rich. And they could certainly be paying higher taxes for the sake of contributing to sort of more inclusive societies. So that takes me to the politics of inequality and redistribution. And when I started this project on business power and tax politics, scholars were paying a lot of attention to social policy, but there was very little work being done on the tax side of redistribution. Even though in a lot of cases, weak tax capacity really constrained social spending. And of course, we know that low tax capacity creates all sorts of other problems for the state's ability to try to promote inclusive development. There's growing recognition now that progressive taxes on income and wealth could actually raise quite a lot of revenue in Latin America, precisely because they're so concentrated at the top. And in addition, we have economists like Piketty and Emmanuel Saez who have shown that progressive income taxation can really be an important redistributive tool in its own right. The main question that I'm asking here is essentially how and when can democracies tax economic elites? And my framework for addressing this question draws on business power. So instrumental, which involves political engagement, and structural, which has to do with market reactions. So business as you would expect, is a very important player in tax politics, whether we're talking about individual firms and investors or whether we're talking about business associations as organized political actors. My starting point is that business and economic elites more generally tend to resist higher taxes. They want to protect their core material interests. But they may or may not have power to be able to shape policy decisions. So I'm basically trying to get at these questions of who gets what, when, and how, and this business power framework gives us a lot of leverage for being able to explain variation in how and when elites are able to get the policies that they want. So I just want to take you very briefly through my explanatory framework. Instrumental power is the capacity to engage in deliberate political actions like lobbying. I'm using a power resources approach, so I'm identifying specific sources of instrumental power that help economic elites shape policy outcomes. So these can be relationships with policymakers that enhance access and create bias in favor of economic elites, and they could be other resources that help business get what it wants more effectively. So for example, relationships with policymakers would include ties to political parties that treat business and economic elites as a core constituency. Another example would be recruitment into government, where business people are given appointments in a cabinet or a ministry. Other resources here, cohesion I find to be especially important. So by cohesion, I just mean the capacity to engage in collective action and maintain unity. So organization plays an important role there. Now, structural power comes from the profit maximizing behavior of firms and investors. So if policymakers think that a reform might lead to reduced investment, they may rule it out for fear of harming growth and employment. So the first key point about structural power is that it does not require any organization or political action. Instead, market signals coordinate how firms and investors react in the economic arena. The second important point is that structural power works through policymakers' expectations about how investors are going to respond to a particular reform. So that means that policymakers have to believe that the reform that they're considering will actually create negative investment incentives that might mess up the economy. If they don't anticipate that, then structural power is either weak or it's simply not relevant for policymaking. So what this means is that policymakers' perceptions matter for structural power and whether it's going to have an effect. And I just want to point out there to remember that even highly trained economists may disagree about what kind of effect a reform is going to have, given all the complexities that we get in real-world economies. So I essentially argue that business interests will shape policy decisions when either their instrumental power or their structural power is strong. And when you have more than one type of power, more than one source of power, you're going to see business getting what it wants more consistently and more extensively. Business power explains most of the cases that I look at in the book, but in a handful of cases, popular mobilization mattered as well. So popular mobilization can play an indirect role by generating revenue needs, for example, to finance social spending that popular sectors are demanding. It can also play a more direct role if popular sectors reject broad-based taxes, so that can force governments to try to raise revenue from economic elites instead. And you can even have popular sectors mobilizing to demand that economic elites pay higher taxes. Now, what's I think quite remarkable here is how few cases there are where this dynamic is relevant. So I see this in only 2 out of 30-some reform episodes that I study. And in cases where popular mobilization was absent, taxing economic elites rarely became electorally salient. So I think this really underscores the importance of looking at business power, because in most cases, taxing economic elites is a realm of elite politics. So this is how my argument plays out at the cross-national level for these 3 countries that I look at. So in Chile, businesses' very strong instrumental power kept key tax reforms off of the agenda until very recently. In Argentina, business was generally much weaker, so governments had a lot more leeway to be able to increase taxes on income and wealth and profits. However, some sectors like finance did have substantial power during specific time periods, and that allowed those sectors to block tax increases that had sector-specific impact. And then in Bolivia, we have sort of very interesting interactions between business power and popular mobilization that led to variation across different tax policy areas. In the case of Chile, we also see some really interesting variation over time. So in previous years, strong business power had kept important tax reforms off of the agenda. After Bachelet was reelected in 2013, we see this very radical reform initiative that was designed to dramatically increase taxation of economic elites. So what changed there was, first of all, the student mobilization counterbalanced business power. And secondly, businesses' instrumental power declined after the 2013 elections, in large part due to the right's loss of seats in Congress and their poor showing in that election. Since the conference agenda themes also include this issue of politically feasible reforms for reducing inequality, I also just wanted to flag that I identified this menu of reform strategies that can be used to facilitate at least incremental or marginal tax increases when you have strong business power and no popular mobilization to speak of. So these reform strategies essentially involve either tempering elite antagonism, not bothering them too much, and or mobilizing public support. And there are ways that you can do that through how you design the policy on the tax side of the fiscal equation, or there are ways to do that by linking the tax increase to benefits for different sectors. Now, I've been emphasizing that public opinion matters much less for tax politics than business power, but public opinion can matter at the margins, and it can make a difference for passing incremental reforms. Right? So politicians who might otherwise favor business and economic elites can feel electoral pressure to do otherwise. And especially, I just want to flag one especially effective strategy for mobilizing public support would be linking to popular benefits like social spending. And this is something that governments in Chile have done ever since 1990 very effectively. So coming back to the question of economic elites and their contribution to social inclusion, a lot of authors have argued that strong business organization and cohesion facilitate socially desirable outcomes. So that would include higher direct taxes and good economic governance and equitable outcomes more broadly. But in highly unequal societies, these factors may be much less beneficial. So in quite a number of Latin American cases, we've seen strong business organizations really helping to block redistributive reforms. So the point that I want to make here is that organization and cohesion are sources of power. And economic elites can use them to promote their interests in ways that may or may not contribute to the broader public good. And then regarding democracy and inequality, on the one hand, this is not a median voter story. Right. The poor are not setting the tax rate on the rich, and by and large, taxing economic elites has been a debate between economic elites and political elites with this very marginal role for voters. But this is not a story of monolithic elite influence either. So money as a resource is clearly very important, but there are other sources of power that matter too. And those sources of power, including cohesion and linkages to particular parties, vary quite a bit even across Latin America's highly unequal democracies. So this business power framework, I think, really allows us to account for the multiple means and multiple mechanisms of influence. And just looking forward to the panel tomorrow on governance, I think that this kind of approach could be quite fruitful for analyzing prospects for reducing inequality in Latin America. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Tasha. Now it's Florencia Torches' turn. She is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at NYU, and also has an affiliate of the Steinhardt School of Education and the Global Institute of Public Health. And I think we're going to hear more about mobility, intergenerational mobility, and how it's related to education and inequality broadly in an international comparison framework. I don't know.
Not quite. Thank you, Nora, very much.
But that's what it says here.
For somewhat.
Well, anyway,
Can I
it's going to
borrow
be
a
good.
laser pointer by any chance? So, thank you very much. Home is, I don't know. Thanks so much for the invitation, for organizing this important conference. So I suppose I was invited to talk about intergenerational mobility, which I've done some research on. But to be honest with you, I decided to take advantage of the fact that I'm the only sociologist in this panel and that I have some dissatisfaction with the work on intergenerational mobility, starting with my own, to just move a little beyond that. So I want to pose the question about how does inequality matter, right? And talk a little bit about potential why we care about inequality and the potential consequences of inequality for the intergenerational transmission of advantage. So I really enjoyed and appreciated the first panel that gave us a macro level overview. I want to talk about more micro level mechanisms, if you will. So one main reason why high inequality matters is because it's correlated with low intergenerational mobility, right? Low equality of opportunity. And we do know that Latin America is the most unequal region of the world, as was shown. And it's also based on the very limited information that we have, the least mobile, at least when we consider economic mobility. The story is different for class mobility, as sociologists would claim. But as important as this finding is, that has been systematized in the Gatsby curve, right, that Kruger popularized, there are at least two dissatisfactions with the focus on intergenerational mobility as a negative corollary and a source of concern with high inequality. The first is that mobility, intergenerational mobility, that is the association between well-being of the parents and well-being of the adult children, refers to how things were decades ago, right? The level of inequality, the institutional framework, the policies in place when those children that now we observe are adults are growing up. And therefore, that may have little relevance for current policy making. As Nora was indicating this morning, one important driver of the decline in inequality in Latin America is educational expansion that happened 2 decades ago. And that, of course, matters. But usually decision makers want to know what to do right now, right? The second dissatisfaction with the work on mobility is it's bivariate focus. Mobility, the study of mobility is furiously bivariate in the sense that it really focuses on parental income, say, adult children income, anything that happens in between, and what really matters in terms of how inequality gets reproduced across generation is left a little bit aside, and that's not a fault of the study of mobility. Getting the intergenerational association right is not minor feat, but it just opens the question of what is it that drives the transmission of advantage. And here we start the kind of, there's room for speculation. Some people claim it's mostly budget constraint, social capital, investment in education. Some people bring genetics up, and it's all just genetic transmission, family socialization, and so on. So what I want to kind of invite to add to the study of mobility and the relevance of inequality for this is the relationship called between social origins, circumstances, family background, whatever happens in the origins, and children's outcomes, that is, outcomes early in the life cycle, before we move to when people become adults. And I want to focus on specific mechanisms for the transmission of advantage across generations, starting as early in the life course as possible. And this comes from recent findings in the biological sciences that suggest that early impacts, early shocks, what happens to you early on in the life course can really set trajectories of disadvantage that is hard to undo. I'm going to give you a very brief example based on my work, because I know it better, of course. So I'm going to use the example of stress, right? Stress is one plausible mechanism whereby both absolute deprivation, that is poverty, and relative deprivation, that is inequality, where you're placed in the hierarchy, affects life chances, right? And the effect of stress exposure, I'm gonna claim here, trying to emphasize the early stages of the life course, may start even before birth. And this matters because if poor children are exposed to stress early on in life, then that can set a set of developments that are detrimental. The issue, of course, is that stress is correlated with many terrible things that happen to people, right? So if we want to address this question, we need to isolate stress from its unfortunately common correlates. How do we do that? One way to do it is natural experiments. That's what I do. I use a major earthquake in my native Chile as a natural experiment for stress. Why? Because an earthquake is perhaps the closest possible thing in the real world to allocating stress at random in a lab, right? Who gets the earthquake, who doesn't, within Chile, which is prone to earthquakes, is really random. And because this earthquake that happened in Chile in 2005 caused very high levels of stress and anxiety, but very limited damage. So we can claim with some certainty that stress and not everything else, right? Mm-hmm. So using that and starting as early as possible in the life cycle, I analyzed the effect on birth outcomes. That's the earliest I could see, right after birth. And exposure, this is the time of exposure. This is all based on a bunch of causal inference approaches that I'm not going to get into at all now. So, but exposure in the first trimester of the pregnancy, if you were unlucky enough to be in utero during the first trimester of gestation, that population on average gets a decline in birth weight of 50 grams. That's small, but it's an average across the entire population. Then if we move to the probability of low birth weight below 5 pounds, this is really bad. We know that low birth weight is bad. We see that if you were unlucky enough to be born, to be in utero in the first trimester when the earthquake occurred, that population experienced an increase in low birth weight by 2 percentage points. The average in Chile of low birth weight is 5%. This means an increase from 5 to 7%. Depending on the size of the population, we're talking about hundreds or maybe thousands of babies who would have not be born low weight had the earthquake not occurred. Okay, so this provides evidence that I think is somewhat persuasive that exposure to stress even before birth matters. But I'm interested in inequality. That's what, that's the invitation here, to talk about how inequality matters. And birth weight is a marker for later disadvantage, but they're not deterministic pathways of disadvantage, or are there? That is the question. And as we know now from neurobiology and from the social scientists, the effect of this early shock, or any early shock for that matter, may persist over time such that, as Heckman claims, a child who falls behind may never catch up, so inequality becomes persistent. To address this question, we did a panel survey, and we are analyzing the effect of being exposed to this major stressor in utero on cognitive ability during childhood. cognitive ability is a major, major outcome. It's a really, really important determinant of educational attainment and socioeconomic well-being. So it matters in its outcomes. We use well, I suppose there's no psychologist here, but we use the Wechsler intelligence test very, very common
If you
in
have
the field.
kids, you know that too.
Say that again?
If you have kids, you know it too.
There you
You're a
go.
psychologist.
There you go. You get with these WISC reports, right? So verbal dimension of the WISC performance total. These are just to show that the effects are consistent across the dimensions of cognitive ability. Let me caveat, whatever that measures, whatever that means. It matters in its outcome, so it's good enough for me. Okay, the effect is a decline in the WISC by 0.2, these are standard deviations, 0.2 standard deviations, not statistically significant. These are the confidence interval, they touch 0. This is an overall, 0.2 is not altogether negligible. I mean, those of you who do policy interventions, we find a 0.2 standard deviation increase, and there's something to be, considered. But it's not significant. This is, however, the overall effect. And what it's very likely, based on all the evidence that we have, based on the contributions of people here, that this effect should be sensitive to inequality, should depend on economic advantage. So the next step is to assess that. I'm going to divide the population into 3 groups, 3 classes, if you will. Families in which the mom has less than high school graduates, and moms with college education. These are my 3 classes. And when I stratify the effect by taking into account inequality, these are the findings. If you don't forget everything I've said, and most likely we're going to forget part of it. This is what matters. The effect of stress exposure in utero is very large and negative on cognitive abilities, very large and negative among the poor. This is between half and 2/3 of a standard deviation. This is huge. There's no intervention or few interventions that compare with this. The effect among the so-called middle class and the wealthy, the other 2 bars, is non-existent. What does this is just one empirical exercise. We can think of many. What does this tell us about the question that we're trying to address today? I want to offer some reflections, somewhat speculative. Why is that this effect, very early in life course, is so stratified? We can rule out many things. I'm not going to show, but it's not because of unequal exposure. It's not that the poor are more exposed. It's not because of unequal reactivity. It's not because there is an unequal initial effect on birth weight. The most likely explanation is the unequal parental responses to initial disadvantage. And that's why I'm going to claim inequality. This is one of the many reasons why inequality matters in the reproduction of inequality of the life course. What the qualitative work, in-depth interviews, is strongly suggesting is that affluent, or in this case I should say middle class and affluent families, are successful at compensating. They mobilize large amount of resources to fully and successfully compensate for the child's early disadvantage. Poor families at the moment, in the context I'm analyzing, are not able to do so, and the disadvantage persist over the early life course. So let me just try to use this example to draw conclusions about the topic we are discussing. First of all, it is not, based on this evidence, the case that a child who falls behind never catches up, but the ability to catch up appears to be extremely unequal. Disadvantaged children are not, the initial question was disadvantaged children. One reason why poverty is so toxic for children is because of the stresses it involves. I found that disadvantaged children are not only more likely to be exposed to stress, this is not this research, we knew that from before, but also less likely to catch up through, in this case, a critical mechanism, which is family compensation. this matters because given that cognitive ability is so relevant for later outcomes, educational and beyond, then the implication of this finding is that intergenerational reproduction of advantage and disadvantage may be quite advanced even before the child moves to secondary school, right? And this suggests that looking at these processes early in life, as opposed to just the bivariate correlation between parents' standings as adults, children's standings as adults, is really kind of a new challenge for those of us interested in the intergenerational reproduction of inequality. Interestingly, even we haven't talked much about the pattern of inequality, but many, I think it's very well known that the pattern of inequality in Chile is characterized by concentration at the top. The excess inequality is in large part driven by the fact that the rich are too rich. Of course, inequality is always related to concentration, but this is rather extreme. But here, the difference that makes the difference is the difference between the poor, people at the lower end, and the rest. And this is rather pure speculation. The alteration of this mechanism for the reproduction of inequality that this research suggests, which involves family dynamics, most likely will require rather sustained and persistent long-term reduction of inequality. A change of a few years will likely not alter these deeply embedded dynamics that result from socioeconomic constraints and scarcity, right? So with this, I end. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So where's Chico?
Yeah.
Very nice. Okay, so where's Richard? Richard, do we need to finish at 12 sharp, or we have some
We shouldn't go much over
minutes?
5 minutes, 10 minutes at most.
Okay. All right, so then let's be efficient and let's use this time, if you don't mind, for questions from the audience who has not been able to speak so far. But I think it was a very nice panel that gave us very different perspectives, sociologists, political science, and economics, and I think it's a great opening to what we are going to be discussing throughout this conference. So anybody wants to jump in? Yes, Julian.
I have a very particular question to the fascinating paper that Florencia presented. And I wonder whether you actually have looked at whether what you're finding has to do with income or not, whether this has to do with income credit constraints by the poor. So, because you were talking about inequality, but what you really were looking at was mother's education. So I wonder what is the mechanism you think that is driving this result? Is it income? Is it mothers not knowing what to do? Is it relative that matters? Is it inequality that matters? Or is it absolute that matters? That people were poor and they were not able to cope?
Yeah, that's a really important question. I'm going to say a couple of very brief things, and then we can talk some more. The dimensions of disadvantage, the way I can measure them here in this survey are so highly correlated that I cannot disentangle very much the different dimensions that could possibly produce this effect. Based on the interviews, however, it seems an explanation that really involves all of them seems to be emerging is given different dimensions of disadvantage, constraints, marginality, lack of access to distance from service, and so on, rather than pure human capital or budget constraint, seem to contribute to a particular type of parental socialization and parenting styles. So I would move beyond the net effects, if you will, but let me stop there for now.
Anybody else?
Well, your paper is very much related to the front page of the Harvard Review in the last issue. It's the work by Sendil Mulainat and who is doing it, is essentially reaching a similar conclusion that scarcity, which is very much related to poverty, create a lot of stress and makes it very difficult to adjust to. I assume you are familiar with this work, and I can lend you the paper.
Thank you. I had the chance to read it. This is extremely important work, not only because of the topic, but also because of the pains the authors take in finding identification strategies that would capture something close to a causal effect, right? However, my speculation is it's a little different. They're excellent at capturing the short-term effect of scarcity, right? I mean, after the crop, before the crop, this changes over the year, and one of the papers, farmers recover, if you will, after the crop when there's less scarcity. These findings may suggest that the effect of inequality and disadvantage may get not only under your skin, but also under your psyche in a way that is more long-term, and therefore altering that may require more time than just, a transfer and then you see an effect. In that sense, I think they're complementary.
Rebecca?
I have two questions. One to Florencia in the sense that of public policy implications and how, with these results, you go for a policy implication that doesn't tax parents more. And how do you go beyond individual responsibility in terms of parenting and also social responsibility? That's one question, because that's a debate, yes, and I would like to hear what there is proposed. And also to you in terms of the tax reform, because I would like to know if you have discussed the whole issue of specific taxes for specific tasks. If you raise taxes and you have, how do you call it in English? Cuando son impuestos específicos.
Excise.
Targeted.
Excise.
Exactly. That's it. So you said that will help, the tax reform, because it will help also for public mobilization. But there is, I would like to hear, because there is a huge resistance from the economic community, for that. Although I believe you are right, but also that you didn't mention that you will also be able to mobilize public support for tax reform if there is more transparency and accountability in the expenditure itself. And that was not part of what I heard. So I would like you to refer to that too.
Florencia and Tasha.
Let me be very brief. I think that's really an important question, right? And let me just say that I understand that a risk is to say, well, parents are not doing a good job, and let's push it. It's a culture. There's something wrong in the culture. I just would, anyone who says that, I would like to invite them to go to these households and see the lives of people and see which type of expectation and which type of parenting strategies can you engage in given massive levels of disadvantage. So I think that is a quite myopic interpretation. A better interpretation, after understanding the lives of people, is, like I said at the end, in order to provide some minimal resources for families to be able to cope with an adverse and scarce world, is you have to provide sources of safety, security, stability, and resources, economic resources, for a rather extended period of time, as opposed to just some, little things here and there. But I know that this is a little short, but let me stop here.
So I think what you were asking about was earmarking, the idea that you increase a tax with a specific spending destination or goal in mind. So a couple things to say. I know economists tend to not like that because it creates budget rigidities. The Chileans have generally done that in a way that isn't explicitly earmarking, because earmarking is not constitutional in Chile, but they do it in a way that makes clear that the revenue is going to be devoted to that purpose in a way that's not necessarily rigidly earmarked. So that's one way to perhaps get around that. All of the strategies that I put up certainly have trade-offs. So one thing will get you something, it will give you something more negative in a different realm, whether it's political or it's a budget rigidity. So it's all about managing sets of trade-offs. In terms of accountability on the expenditure side and the importance of that, certainly I think that is very important, you're right. My to temper that side of the debate, I think that you will find in any Latin American country that the economic elites who are facing taxation are going to say that that's a problem no matter what country you're in. So if you talk to business and economic elites in Chile, they're going to talk about how inefficient the state is, and they're going to say there's corruption and so on and so forth, and that was, 10 years ago as well. Just as if you go to Mexico, people are going to say, the state is so, or Argentina, the state is ineffective, it's corrupt, it's not transparent, so why should we pay more taxes? So to me, that's sort of a constant, and the perception can be there among the people, especially among economic elites. It can be an excuse, it can be a perception, but I don't know how directly it's linked to actual, whatever we would think of trying to get at some more objective measure of transparency. But then also in regard to that, so my focus is on trying to tax economic elites, not the middle class, right? And so when you do that, I think you curtail some of that reaction, or you limit it to a particular sector that's likely to be resisting it no matter what. But clearly transparency is important. I'm just not sure that there's a way to measure it effectively or to relate it to perceptions or to correct it in the short term, even per se. Is that addressed?
Sergio,
So this is for Chico actually. So I was surprised as you with the result of minimum wage. So in a scenario, suppose as we expect there's a slowdown in economies, right? In Brazil in particular, how you see that increase of minimum wage playing a role? How important that would be, and what would be? I know it's very hard to anticipate, but I was really worried to see that minimum wage, a huge increase in minimum wage, has happened also in Colombia and so on.
But
Really
it-
have
the
has a negative effect or almost zero effect on inequality. So suppose now the economy goes, start slowing down. How do you see the effect of that particular variable right in the future?
Yeah, so we were very surprised as well. I had anticipated this paper when we started writing it as being a paper that would bring labor market institutions to, account for a much larger share of the decline than in the end it turns out to have had this. So the way I think we interpret it, but Julian can add to this, is, this is where these Oaxaca blinder type things can sometimes be informative. We've all done them and we all kind of hesitate a little bit, and there are a number of problems. But the fact that the negative effect, the effect countervailing inequality, came from this endowment effect, really pointed to that increase in the non-compliance, right? So I think what was happening is you're pushing this policy farther than the market will take it. In an economy perhaps like the United States or some other one where, if minimum wages were ever to rise here, that might lead to unemployment. In an economy like ours, it leads to informality, right? So there's an easy mechanism to deal with that. But then actually, because you're pushing the protection beyond what the market can take, that turns out to have led, controlling for everything else, to an unequalizing effect. When the economy was growing very fast and it could support, so you had the miracle years, right, of the 2000 to 2008, unemployment was falling, formalization was rising, and the economy could support the minimum wages rising, then it was unequalizing like we expect. So, I guess I'm just repeating what I said earlier, but what that leads me to expect in the future is that if we go through a period when the labor market cannot support that increase, i.e. low growth and so on and so forth, then to keep pushing that policy may be mistaken, because the market may adjust as it did in the past, which is to increase informality. So it points in some sense to something that I guess economists have always known, which is that there is a limit to what minimum wages can do. It's not particularly novel, but for a while because we were observing all these things go together, we thought, it was hard being a neoliberal economist talking to Brazilian politics. So you can't raise the minimum wages and reduce inequality. Well, we can. We're doing it. Well, but there may be some limits. So that's.
Yeah, and I don't know, I mean, I think that also disaggregating the two time periods is very important,
Right.
because that's, but, there's Ricardo Lago, I don't know your name, sorry.
That's Miguel Paz.
Miguel Paz, he
Yes.
was next. I'm going to follow the strict order of
Thank
hand
you very much.
raising, if you don't mind.
It's a question for Tasha. That connects also to what Florencia was saying. In the framework of power that you were talking about, in the power structures, which are the counter powers that persist beyond the cohesion of economical elites when you are in a country where the economical elites have patronage over the political elites in a non-transparent way? Bottom line, or just trying to make it simpler, how can movements like the student movement in Chile be a force beyond the momentum that they started and generate a debate that goes further along when economical elite is so intertwined with political elite and it sponsors it?
Okay, so how can it be enough to sort of break
Yeah.
that dynamic? That's an excellent question. I don't think I have a good answer for that. I mean, certainly in Chile, I think we're seeing a huge impact of that movement in terms of everything that's happening now. So, how rare is it that we would get that kind of dynamic that really sort of opens up the scope of what's possible, and campaign finance reform and everything that we're seeing now coming on the agenda? I'm not sure. But I mean, if you want to think about Bolivia, perhaps for the period that I'm most focusing on, well, yes and no. I mean, you're always going to have a lot of this dynamic because there's so much wealth in the business sector that's going to influence the politics, and it's going to feed into the political elites, and there's going to be money changing hands there, and so on and so forth. But if you get people on the bottom who are outside of that elite interlinkages and so forth, really mobilized to the extent that the political and the economic elite are threatened in their ability to stay in power, then you are going to start seeing changes that wouldn't otherwise happen. So that was sort of Bolivia leading up to Evo Morales coming in. I don't know if that addresses it, but that's what comes to mind. Yeah,
Okay,
it's
I have
it's a big question.
3 more hands that I am going to give the opportunity. President Lagos first, then Marcelo Neri, and then Steven.
Could we collect all the questions and then give everyone a last chance,
Yes.
just in the interest of
Yes.
efficiency?
I think that the 3 panels are quite amazing in the sense that they were able to deal with so different things at the same time and cover wages, wealth and power, and then the issue about high inequality and closely related with low intergenerational mobility. And I would like to address the last one. In what sense? In the sense that in Chile's 1990, you have about 200,000 students going to university. In Chile 2011, you have 1 million plus 100,000 in just 21 years. The interest point is this. In 1990, of that 200,000, the upper 20% of incomes in Chile were able to send their kids 40%. So 40% of the university age belonging to the upper 20% were able to be at the university. And the lowest quintile, only 4% were at the university. And that's perfectly what you say, because if you are the children of fathers with both of them university degree, then very obviously are going to be in the upper 20% of them, etc. What happened in 2011, the year of the student movement? In 2011, what you have is 1 million. And the 40% of the highest 20% became 60% of that increases, And with regard to the lowest 20, that was 4, now was 16. It's still a tremendous difference. 60 versus 16. Can you see that? There was would you say that one increased only 50%, but the other increased 4 times, but that's a joke. It's simply still behaving the way that you mentioned. What is important is to think that in 2011, of those 10 university students, 7 was first generation in the families. So, what about the intergenerational mobility that is taking place at that moment? And those students that were in the street were not the 200,000 of 1990, but were the 1 million. Until what extent what happened was because they were the children of democracy, because by definition all of them were born in 1990. What you have was a tremendous change because given the tax system in Chile, they were very happy to be at the university, extremely unhappy because you have to pay for that. And since the solution was to give some credit and you couldn't pay the credit, then you have to go to the street. I'm with the period. But what I think, what may be in the future, with regard to the question of social mobility, when you have the going from 7 out of 10 first iteration, and that took place in 20 years, what is going to be about the future? Are you going to keep that intergenerational mobility in such a way? Or things are going to be back to normal?
Thank you, Marcelo. All right, so, you raised your hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to know, in your calculations, does the effect of the minimum wage on the basic pension, is that not counted or is that counted? Because of course that doesn't matter what the labor market conditions are, because they're gonna get paid more. And that was an important part of the Brazil analysis in your book.
So, you wanna
I
figure
thought
out?
there was another question.
He
He declined.
Oh. Well, the question that was posed is extremely relevant. We know that education provides both the most important avenue for reproduction, to the extent that, wealthy parents can afford more and better education for their children, and at the same time, the main avenue for mobility and the most amenable to policy intervention, for that matter. So it's crucial. The case of Chile is interesting because it really emphasizes the important distinction that analysts need to make between the expansion and allocation. Chile, as many countries in Latin America at different levels, has experienced a massive expansion in Chile, as you were highlighting at the post-secondary level. And that is important because that increases the chances for everyone. The question about mobility is more about, as you said, with your empirical examples of trends, it's about allocation. Given that there are more places at the top, who gets where, right? And as you indicated, there has been massive expansion for everyone. The allocation based on social origins has changed very little, very little. In addition to that, we have the dimension that I hope will be discussed, which is when quantitative inequality declines, meaning more people move to the top, two things may happen. First, there is a new top, right? Which it's not going to happen very soon, but still. Second, there is horizontal inequality, and type of institution starts matter increasingly more. So it's a question about quality, where you get within that system. Having said all that, this is all to say, it's from certain perspectives, expansion is very good news in terms of mobility. The jury is still out, and it crucially depends, of course, on the institutional arrangements and policies that facilitate those transitions for the most disadvantaged, children in society.
Before you answer, Stephen, can I add another one?
Mm-hmm.
Because an increasing minimum wage, in addition to setting wages for pensioners and transfer recipients, etc., may also pull the wages of others because there's a multiplier effect at the bottom. which I think you have to make a comment on. Okay.
Can I add something else? What, given, in particular, given the increase in the minimum wage, why is that informality declined so substantially? What happened that made that possible?
So three great questions. Your Stephen's question, in this analysis, that effect of the minimum wages on benefits, pensions, and other things is not included because this is only labor income.
Right.
So that's excluded. But what your point is important is it cautions us to say that you shouldn't extrapolate from this to the effect of the minimum wages on, or you should be very careful in extrapolating from this to the effect of minimum wages on the distribution of household income per capita, because there, that other effect would matter. And I think actually it's an interesting thing to look at. What happens when you bring that into effect? Because there's all these non-labor incomes that are increasing, and there is no non-compliance issue, right?
Yeah.
Typically, those of us who've worked on this a lot, will say there are much better ways of transferring money to poor people than through the minimum wages because of various reasons. But nevertheless, the empirical question is, does it have a positive effect or not when you take that into account, which is not addressed here. Your question was on?
When the minimum wages actually become a puller of wage, even if, even
effect
the
of
density increases, you may be.
Yeah. So I keep looking at Marcelo because he was, I think, the original author of the lighthouse effect. No, it wasn't going to.
Unfortunately not.
But at least in Brazil,
So-
in the application to Brazil.
So who was the lighthouse
I don't know who
inventor?
did the lighthouse effect. He will tell us later. But his earlier work pointed to the existence of that in Brazil very strongly. And that, of course, again, is not captured here directly because we have simply a dummy for whether you're below or above. Now, of course, those effects are in the data, but whether they're not necessarily captured by
Ascribed
that
to.
dummy. So that's another interesting point that one would like to look at. Go ahead, start taking notes. This is a good old one. And Florencia's reminding me, sorry.
Why do the informality declines?
So in the paper, we do have a little bit of a discussion of that. I mean, there was, and again, Marcelo Julian will know a bit better than me, but there was a change in the technology of enforcement, which was quite substantial. So the PT government, the same government that was implementing all of these things, also put a lot more effort behind the enforcement of contracts within firms. So the fiscais, right, would come more often, and so on. And in addition, this was done not only in the Ministry of Labor, but there was the strengthening of a public prosecutor's office ability to look into those questions. So there's a little bit of a discussion of those institutional
Institutional
changes.
mechanisms.
So we don't have a causal analysis of that to see whether that is the sole cause. There may have been issues on the demand side as well, efficiency wages, whatever, during the period of growth. That's another paper. We merely point to the fact that there are some institutional changes that are likely to contribute to it.
Okay, so lunchtime, and
All right.
let's give a hand to our panelists.